This video isn't just a review of Mario 64, it's a review of the game's influence as well. A lot of the reviews I've seen on this game have been very thorough in many aspects, except specifically the aspects that I want to focus on. Because of that, along with the game's popularity and the fact that you know most of the things there are to know about Mario 64, I would like to focus on a different aspect of the game. First, I'll go over the game itself, looking at it from its historical time frame, to show how it differentiated itself from the other games from the time, along with the pitfalls that it faced as an early 3D platformer. Then, I'll look at the gaming landscape from a wider lens, to show how Mario 64 fits into the landscape, go over what the game meant for the industry, and dispel some common misconceptions. Then finally, I'll talk about my personal experience with it for a bit, just as a little treat at the end. Let's begin. Mario 64 is a good game, one of the best games of 1996, but as all games, it's not perfect. But let's talk about the good sides first. Mario 64 created the 3D collectathon genre. Basically, instead of progressing through the game linearly with optional side trinkets like in Jumping Flash or Crash Bandicoot, you collected a currency, stars in this case, and used this currency to progress throughout the levels. This gave you a lot of flexibility in how you could clear levels. You could chip away at whichever star interested you, and the game lets you go loose pretty quickly. Is a level too hard for you? In Crash, that means banging your head against a wall. In Mario 64, that means you just have to complete a different level and deal with this one later, when you're ready for it. Tons of games have further evolved this system into their own versions of it. Spyro the Dragon lets you collect gems, dragons, and eggs, and they're level completion agnostic. You just need a specific amount of each of them to reach a new world. How and where you collect them is down to you. This gives developers the ability to hide some of them in really funny places. And this level of collectathon progression was also moved back into 2D gaming with games like Rayman Legends, where games open depending on how many teensies you saved. Mario 64 was also one of the first games to have relatively complex character control in a 3D platformer. You see, most platformers have relatively rudimentary movement. Like how in Crash 1, you only really move in 8 directions, spin, and jump. This simplicity lets developers make far tighter platforming sections because it's predictable, but it also has its limits. Mario's moveset is meant to be fun first, like playing with a toy. Because of that, he has a whole variety of different moves he can use in different situations. But those moves come at a slight game design cost. Basically, you need to design around players of very varying skill levels actually knowing what to do with these moves and how to do them. Because of that, this complex moveset isn't really that necessary for most stars, with just a standard set of jumps and solid stick control being enough to get most of them. However, the more skilled you are, far more opportunities open up in how you can move Mario around using his moveset. Of course, both types of movesets have their ups and downs, but Mario 64's moveset has a few special downsides exclusive to only it. First of all, the camera is, well, pretty famously not very good. It's not awful by any means, but it's definitely not that good. It's relatively tolerable some of the time. The issue is it gets stuck pretty often, it locks into specific angles, so sometimes it's really bad for specific jumps, sometimes it gets really angry in indoor areas, and in general, it is kind of frustrating to deal with. And Mario's movement is, well, it's definitely the first 3D movement in a Mario game. The main issue is Mario is just far too heavy. While the moveset is really good for running around in an open area, trying to turn on a small platform is a very good way to make Mario just bolt off of it. He also just accelerates like a diesel Golf Lupo, and sometimes you just randomly bonk on things. While the movement itself has a ton of good ideas, the execution of those ideas really isn't the best. Platforming can sometimes feel very clunky and frustrating, some sections can be far harder than they need to be, and well, that's something you only really notice later on because of the level design. Yeah, so a lot of the early levels are pretty fun, right? Well, later on, that begins to change. The later levels become far more focused on tight platforming, something a plumber really isn't built for, and that makes him struggle. Similarly to the cool movement having some issues in its implementation, the collectathon aspect also has some frustrating issues. Sometimes levels repeat themselves, like in Babam Battlefield. Hey, you just ran all the way to the top of the mountain to fight King Babam. Now do the same run again, but this time you're racing Cooper the Quick. If you keep track of this sort of design, it can really feel stale and annoying, something which later levels will struggle with way more. Tall Mountain is a frustrating mess of a level that, for several stars, makes you run all the way to the top of the mountain, just so you can do something slightly different once you're there, and the later levels in general just struggle from this little issue. Also, you know the creepypasta-esque wet-dry world negative emotional aura? Well, I understand why people feel that way about those levels. You see, some people have described Mario 64's levels as Windows 95 screensavers because they're kind of nonsensical, and they also feel like test levels quickly slapped together. They don't feel coherent. Actually, Mario 64 as a whole is really incoherent from a design perspective, and there's a big reason for that. Look at other 1996 Nintendo 64 games. Look at Mario 64. Have you noticed how Mario 64 is kind of ugly? That's because a lot of Mario 64's textures come straight off a texture CD. They're basically stock textures that have been slightly modified and put into the game. That is why the level design looks so incoherent and ugly. This is why I feel the game is genuinely a 7 out of 10. It's still good, but no perfect. No games are, especially from so long ago. So let's take a step back. How did the gaming landscape look when this game came out? Well, I have a video that covers the 6 pioneers of 3D platforming, as they all released too close together to steal any ideas from each other, but let's take a few steps back. The first 3D platformer was a game called Alpha Waves. Here it is. You're in a box and running around, Minecraft parkour all the way back in the year 1990. You can move the camera around your guy and jump around. If you want a game that feels less primitive though, here's Geograph Seal from 1994. It's a sharp X68000 game and it's pretty cool. It's in first person and 3D. If I showed you how Jumping Flash looks now, and told you that both of these were made by the same developer, you'd probably figure out Jumping Flash was kind of an anomaly. It was the first 3D platformer that was like, kind of focused on 3D platforming more than anything else, and it was also like a real game and not a tech demo. And honestly, it controls better than Metroid Prime. Not too many people know about this little game, but it's really fun. I recommend it. Stepping outside of 3D platformers, let's look at the entire gaming industry, because there's something I need to get out of the way first. So I would like to split advancements in the gaming industry into two categories: inevitable and innovative. If we would look in real life, an inevitable advancement would be the wheel, as it is much easier to move things that roll around easily. An innovative advancement would be the steam engine, because while we've all boiled water for thousands of years in pots or whatever, it took a guy to realize he could harness this power-to-power machinery to, kick off the Industrial Revolution. Similarly, in the gaming industry, 3D was kinda becoming an almost inevitability. 2D games still kept existing, obviously, but as more and more games could enter this cool new dimension due to the new hardware that was existing at the time, quite a few different types of games popped up. Going back all the way to the 80s, roguelikes and turn-based RPGs existed for ages, and some of the first 3D-esque games that existed, even if they weren't real-time and they were just drawn, were dungeon crawlers. And if you took those dungeon crawlers and gave them some finesse, you would end up with Wolfenstein and later Doom, if you made them real-time. The first-person perspective was a really neat idea for a lot of developers, because it felt pretty immersive, and you could also avoid rendering your character, something that was pretty expensive in the early to mid-90s. Though many games struggled to figure out the whole 3D thing, so as cool as they were to see, a lot of the very early ones were kind of novelties, but some managed to do much more. Some games needed you to see yourself from the outside, may it be because you're piloting a mech, or plane, or some other vehicle. Because of that, some form of camera control had to be created. The way many games went about doing this ranged from really innovative to just basic. MechWarrior 2, a 1995 game, and some other PC games like Flight Sims just let you move your camera around with your mouse, and that was really cool. Mario 64 didn't have a mouse, so the C buttons were used to move your camera at preset angles. Of course, the way Nintendo went about doing this is a little bit problematic, and honestly something I missed while playing Age of Calamity. Like, you should be able to double flick your stick left to rotate the camera exactly by 90 degrees or something, but alas you can't. Anyways, later games like Ocarina of Time just let you center your camera behind Link by pressing R, as Link is most often just fighting enemies in front of him. And that's fine. Some games like MDK, a really fun game by the way, at least on the PlayStation 1 version, just glues your camera to the back of your character and gives you tank controls, though with the way that game controls, it's really not an issue. And that's the thing, games were constantly innovating during this period. Some games like Final Fantasy VII used a whole mixture of different pre-rendered backgrounds in 3D worlds to create a unique and beautiful world. Resident Evil used pre-rendered backgrounds of static cameras which allowed them to plan the game out like it was a horror movie. A very beta horror movie considering the acting in that game, but at least it's not rad. But I'd like to go back to my core point. Many people attribute a controllable camera to Mario 64 or targeting enemies in a 3D space to Ocarina of Time, and FYI, Mega Man Legends, something I've been streaming at you to play for the last I don't know how many videos, implemented the enemy targeting, or well, Z targeting, well before Ocarina of Time did it. By the way, it's called Z targeting because you hold down Z to target, not because of, you know, the XYZ system. Also, Panzer Dragoon, a ton of flight games, Virtual On, Tomb Raider, all of them had lock on, but I'm getting off track. Basically, these are advancements that not only would have been, but have been made, regardless of the existence of these games, and the reason for that is pretty simple. The truth is, the gaming landscape is, well, fucking huge. Tons of different games exist, and the average game has fuck all impact on a genre, regardless of how cool or great it may be. The exceptions to the rule, like Final Fantasy, Mario 64, Gran Turismo, Metal Gear Solid, they all stand out for what they did in their own genres, because they wouldn't be the same without them. JRPGs wouldn't be the same without Final Fantasy, collectathons and 3D platforms to an extent wouldn't be the same without Mario 64. Sim races wouldn't be the same with Gran Turismo, and narrative, story-driven games wouldn't be the same without Metal Gear Solid. But to argue that any of these games influenced each other cross-genre is just kinda dumb. And I'd like to take King's Field as an example. Yeah, so Dark Souls has been shoehorned into this video for just a bit. FromSoft made a few games before Dark Souls, and they were kinda proto-Dark Souls. Some people say that some of them are actually more immersive than Dark Souls, and they're all worth a shot, but TLDR, before Dark Souls there was Demon Souls, and before that there was Shadow Tower, and finally, FromSoft's first series of games, King's Field. This is where the DNA that turned into Dark Souls and later Elden Ring first walked out of the sea, and yet, people still argue that Zelda, or Mario, influenced Elden Ring. Please. So how do I, Azuba, feel about Mario 64? Well, I first encountered Mario 64, just like most retro games, through Let's Plays on very early YouTube. Then at some point in time I played it for a bit, found it okay, but I didn't really do that much with it, as most of the game was already known to me through Let's Plays. My first real romp through the game was on the DS version of the game, something I was unfamiliar with, and something I 150 starred on this very YouTube channel. And then I finished a non-100% run of the Nintendo 64 version on my own, unrecorded mostly because I wanted to get it over with, and have a fresh perspective for this video. Learning about retro games from YouTube is something I and many of the people who grew up on early YouTube can relate to. It's how we experienced these games first. And because of that, because YouTubers, including myself I guess, are the first source people seemingly go to in order to learn about these older games, we need to be as accurate as we can be. And I've been endlessly annoyed by people who continuously misrepresent gaming history due to old grudges, console wars, nostalgia, or whatever, especially when they're really big creators. I'm not a Sonic fan, but I'm a fan of several Hot Wheels games and movies that I will admit are not peak gaming or peak cinema. However, I love them in spite of their flaws, and like if Mario 64 and other games have a similar reputation, it's even easier to love them. They're already agreed upon to be good. Just don't pretend they're perfect, because they're not. And don't pretend they've done everything, that they've created 3D gaming, because they didn't. They didn't at all. And just saying that lets other people completely dismiss those games because, oh, you lied about this, so you've lied about everything else. No, that's dumb. Please don't do that. Instead, play Mega Man Legends 2.